Okay. We're gonna start. How are y'all doing? Good? Great. Week 9. All right. Well, what week 9 means for us is that we only have 4 more lectures, and this is one of the last ones. And a couple things that are important to remember moving forward this week. We have 2 Holocaust survivors coming to visit us on Friday in sections, and this is a required part of the class. So if you did not meet Zenon last Friday, then you should make time to either meet Erica Jacoby or Henry Oster this Friday, March 10th. Please remember that where we're meeting is on here, 306 or 314 Royce Hall. So Royce, the towers, 3rd floor. The sections will basically be going simultaneous. So Erica will be in one room, actually the larger room, because we have sections of the film that we may look at, and Henry will be in the other room. And 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock. Please be on time. So if your section times are normally 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, you should come to the 9 o'clock section. If your sections are normally, say, 10 or 11 o'clock, you should come to the 10 o'clock section. It is useful that you come as close as possible to your section time because the room has a limited number of seats. And one of the things we saw last week is that we didn't have a lot of people show up at 11, but we had a ton of people show up at 12, and we ran out of seats. So you're welcome to sit on the floor, it's fine. But it would be good if 8 and 9 o'clock, come at 9 o'clock. 10 and 11 o'clock, come at 10 o'clock. Good. I will talk about, I want to debrief about the section with Zenon on Thursday. And so I'm going to kind of just defer that from today. So people who came to meet him, I think it was a very positive and really quite extraordinary experience. And we learned a lot. And I want to hear from you about things that you learned. But we're going to do that in the context of talking about Erica and Henry on Thursday. So I'm going to defer that because I have a totally separate lecture today. Yeah. So in terms of things for preparation for Friday, and actually for Thursday too, the film, Swimming in Auschwitz, even if, quite honestly, even if you're not going to come and meet Erica, I recommend the film. It's only, I think it's 58 minutes long. You do need to put this password in. See, it's right there. Some of you email me and say, oh my God, it's private. I can't get it. It's right there. Just read the whole thing. And the same thing goes for Henry Oster, is that you have to register and put this key code in. One question I have, which is regarding the extra credit for the Holocaust Museum. Have any of you actually been able to log in and get the material, or have you had some problems registering still? Anyone logged in and say, I actually saw the material?
The German 59 lecture is there, but then there's no material listed under it.
Okay. Strange. Okay, I emailed them again because they were having some problems with the site. That is to say, I just simply selected everything they had, but apparently people were having trouble registering. So I'm going to figure out, hopefully they can get it resolved in the next, obviously 2 weeks for you all if you decide that you want to do that. Otherwise, if you want to, know something you can do for sure and you want extra credit, the museum is still here in LA, open, 7 days a week. And so I would say if you're interested in finding an opportunity for getting extra credit, this one, number 1. So you can go, it's open not only on weekends, it's also open during the week. You should check the hours though before you go, because on Fridays they close at 2 o'clock, they close early. And I believe that they have limited hours on the weekend. So this is still definitely there. This one I'll try to get resolved. They've had some problems with their website, and I'll try to figure that out. Okay, any other questions? I just remind you about the other last thing that you have due, which is now, I postponed it, like I said, till Sunday, the 12th, so that everyone has a chance to meet and talk with a Holocaust survivor. And that's your last response paper. It's up under week 9. It's been up since last week. And then next week, in week 10, we'll do Possibly actually on Thursday. I'll talk to you about the final exam. So I'm thinking I have a big lecture on Tuesday of next week, and then the last day of class. I think I'll probably do it on this Thursday. I'll give you some sample final exam questions and give you a sense as to what it'll look like. So next class. And then we'll talk, you have a film for next week, paragraph 175, which is about the persecution of gay and lesbian victims. And we'll talk a little bit about two other victim groups, one being the Sinti and Roma, sometimes called gypsies, which is a somewhat derogatory term, and we'll talk about that, and gay and lesbian victims. We'll do that on Tuesday of next week, and then wrap up class really with questions that I'm going to raise today, which are questions around memory and the politics of memory. So this lecture, the last lecture, will actually dovetail nicely with things I'm going to talk about now. All right. Questions? Other? No? We're good? We're good. All right. Good. So here we are. This is where we're starting. Yeah. So I'm going to spend most of the lecture, well, about half lecture actually, will be on Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which hopefully you had a chance to look at and read for today. And the first half of the lecture is really trying to distinguish between two terms that are largely the terms that would describe how we can think about Bernard Schlink's novel, The Reader, and also how we might think about Maus as a work of memory and also history, and in many ways how we think about the post-war situation writ large and what might be seen as a kind of contestation over how one remembers and values and represents the events of the Holocaust. And so this is kind of a question that I wanted to pose to you all, and if any of you are a couple of you are actually in my Fiat Lux class where we talked to Holocaust survivors for the entire quarter, and we talked about in that class, and I want to talk to you about this, is what the difference is between memory and history. And if we had to kind of say, like, well, memory's about these things and history's about these things, where would you draw the distinction between these two things? And I ask you that maybe keeping Maus at the back of your mind, because this is a book, as you realized, which is very much about a survivor, Vladek. It's the father of Art Spiegelman, referred to as Artie in the book. Artie grew up after the war. He doesn't have any direct memories of the Holocaust because he didn't experience these events. His father does have direct memories of these events, but he can't quite tell them all. He tells some of them, he tells them in different ways, sometimes more coherent, sometimes less coherent. But clearly his father is an access point for thinking about the history, right, of the Holocaust. And he also has memories because he has the experiential dimension of having gone through, having survived something. So if you had to kind of classify, kind of make a distinction between these two terms, what's memory and what's history?
I think I would argue that memory is a more individual form or more personal form of history.
Okay.
Because I think when we talk about history, it's what we discussed before, like the plight of the collective, or like Jews as a collective, what happened in the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
When really, I'd say memory has a lot more to do with how one person maybe feels their experience is specific to them and compares it to just something like that.
Okay, I'm going to repeat some of what you said. I think that's very useful. So the idea that memory is more personal, maybe subjective, in the sense that it applies to a singular person. I mean, after all, my memories are not the same as yours. Like, my memories of childhood are not the same memories of your childhood, right? I didn't go through your childhood, and none of us went through each other's childhoods. So in that regard, they're personal. History, you mentioned, is more collective. That is to say, maybe there are structural similarities that maybe many of us shared in terms of our childhoods, but then there are also, obviously clear differences. History, though, is something that's composed, you kind of said, in a kind of broader way. Okay, I think those are some useful differences. Some more personal, maybe more broad. What else? What else do you characterize in terms of these?
If it's your memory, you experience what happens rather than just
You experienced your memories. And you may or may not, I mean, you could say you experienced your history too, but you also probably didn't experience lots of other histories. And yet we have access to them, maybe through books or documentaries or other things, right? So that's already an interesting question, is that history may or may not be experiential, but memory always is. Something else? Yeah? Interesting. Yeah, I like that idea. That's really interesting. Memory, you really can't get away from your memories. You can repress them, obviously. You know, the things that are traumatic, and we don't want to think about them all the time. That time where, you know, you got beat up in 3rd grade, and you're like, gosh, now I'm thinking about that. It makes me upset again. Or obviously things that are really bad. But our memories follow us, right? We can't not say that we can't separate ourselves from them. Ultimately, they are ours, and they come from our experiences, which again are ours. History, you said you can choose, which is kind of interesting. We can choose our history, maybe as an interesting thing. We can choose what we want to learn about. We can choose what we value. We can choose, as a collective, what kind of memorials or monuments we build, and those tell us about how we value the past. You know, it's remarkable, for example, that, I'll just give you an example. Washington, D.C., there's a lot of memorials and museums there. Only this past year was there an African American museum. Tells me something about choosing our history. How do we want to choose it, and how do we want to establish its significance with regard to our collective identity as Americans? Why would it take so long to put such a museum up? You know, maybe it tells us something about priorities. Memory is generally more, you said, emotional, and history more factual, but yet you problematize that also. How did you say?
You can alter both of them, so you can like refer something about like maybe an event based on its outcome, like say like your intentions were this, if they weren't at the time, but you might remember them in a certain way given how it turned out.
Yeah, okay.
So it can be altered by again like what you focus on.
Sure.
And what kind of spin you decide to put on.
Yeah. We tend to think that, memories, are the more, I mean, you say more emotional, history maybe more objective. I think in general that's probably true, but you problematize it next by saying both can be altered. And that's really interesting as well. That is, history is not done once and for all, but we know full well that historians rewrite the past in different ways, or that things that were ignored in the past become considered important later on. So, you know, for example, worker and labor history. Usually histories, we know about the kings and the queens and the princes and, the people in power, but what about the worker, the history of the workers, everyday people, or history of women, or history of minorities? More and more, you have a kind of a broader understanding of, say, American history that's more inclusive and also looks back at ways in which certain stories were either ignored or not told. So history changes. And memory is not static either. Memory changes too, because the way in which I might remember something at different points in my life is going to change depending on the context I'm in, right? That horrible thing that happened when you were 8 years old, maybe when you're 20, it's still horrible. Maybe when you're 30, you'll see it somewhat different. And maybe when you're 50, you've forgotten it altogether. Or perhaps you understand it in a new way. So memory is often a function of the present as much as it is a reflection of events that happened in the past. Anything else we want to add that we haven't said about this? Because these two terms are really interesting for thinking about Spiegelman, because he's playing intensely with both of these terms. He's interrogating them. And with regard to the Holocaust, he's talking about a traumatic event and traumatic memories that are being carried into the future. And that future is, that is, say, that it's after 1945. It's all those ways in which a different generation is encountering something of the past that he himself did not go through, but others did. And how we access both those memories and its history and its importance. Okay, so here's a kind of a nice little summary of some things we talked about. This is typically how, and I think we separate these. I mean, typically we would say, and this is not absolute, typically would say memory is more subjective, is more personal, it's individual. It can certainly be faulty. That is to say, we may not remember everything, may not remember it the same way. And it's certainly experiential. And generally, we would say history is more objective, perhaps authoritative, written by historians who are credentialed, with PhDs and so forth. Maybe it applies more generally, perhaps more scientific, in that it's more objective. It uses sources, it backs them up, it tells a story. But it's important also that this last thing is important, is that history is not just events and it's not just stories, it's both. That is to say, there are events that one went through on an experiential dimension. These are events, things that happened. And then there's the process of putting those events into a narrative, making sense of them. And a narrative can be in many different forms. It can be in film. It can be in the form of a graphic novel. It can be in the form of a work of literature. It can be in the form of a memoir. So you're taking the events and putting them into language, into sentences, right? I mean, Art Spiegelman will say many times, like, I want it chronological. Like, his dad will start talking about something from 1943, and he's on 1941. You're like, wait, I'm confused. Go in order, because the demand of a narrative is one that goes chronological. He's interested in a chronological story. And his father maybe is remembering things that kind of like come in and out. Sometimes his father will even remember Art will be smoking, and his father will suddenly then remember something about needing to keep the ghetto clean. So it's something that prompts his memory. It's almost like it sparks his memory, right? All this is to say is that that these two terms, history and memory, are actually kind of connected to each other in some interesting ways. So I wrote at the bottom that history is always written from a perspective, right? It's always, it's like what we care to privilege, what we care to put in there. Think of Lanzmann. He was also creating a history out of memories, but it was also always edited. It was always composed. It's never truly objective because different things are privileged, other stories are left out. And I would say, and then we found this out from Zenon actually just the other day, memory can also provide a critique of history. He talked about historians leaving many things out, and in particular with regard to how we think about resistance. And so in our class, I talked about kind of like major figures who resisted, and he wanted to point out that there were these everyday folks that sometimes did something for him that he doesn't even know their names. They may have taken a photograph, they may have given him some food, they may have like opened their house for a day, and in many ways he remembers these people as having a profound effect on his ability to survive. And so again, his memories provide a lens to critique history because these people have been left out of history. All these people, that gave him, shelter or food that one time. So memory, like history, can change. Both are constructed. And this kind of goes to your point about, what we choose. They become useful when they speak to the present. That is to say, like it's like you all. It's like for some, I'd like to know, like for reasons that maybe only you know, taking a class on the Holocaust in 2017 seems useful to you. Is knowledge that you are interested in. And it's also knowledge I'm interested in imparting, right? It speaks to something. It maybe speaks to our present in the sense that knowing the past maybe something about that knowledge applies to us at this moment in time. And not just 2017, but 2020, 2025, and also 2000, and whatever else. Perhaps it applies to this last part, which is aspirations for a shared future. Meaning if we actually know this past, we can imagine a different future. One where it either doesn't repeat itself, or perhaps we're armed with the knowledge of how to resist it. So then this kind of gives us a reason for why we study the past in the first place. Right? It's not just because it's past, but also because it's potentially very present, and it could speak to how we think about a shared future. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics of memory, and I'm going to show you a bunch of, now we'll look at pictures, look at a bunch of memorials in particular, and kind of show you that this is, that issues around memory and history are very fungible. Like they change. And they change, again, in terms of how the present wants to think about the past. So this is a memorial actually at Buchenwald. Buchenwald is a concentration camp where Elie Wiesel ended up, right? When he came back on a death march and his father died at the end, and he nearly died before the camp was liberated by the Soviets in 1945. This camp was established in Germany. It's outside of Weimar. It's actually up on a hill. And this is a memorial that was created by the Soviets. This part of Germany was part of East Germany in the 1950s and was allied with the communists sort of behind the Iron Curtain. And a memorial was erected. The memorial is actually still there today. There are other memorials as well. But when you look at this memorial, imagine you're sitting in a concentration camp up on a hill. At the top here is in Roman numerals 1945. Okay, so right here it says 1945. How would you describe the message of this memorial? Like, what is it trying to get across, would you say? Or even just like, what is it composed of? I mean, there's obviously like two parts. There's a sculptural part and an architectural part. Yeah. Say again, I can't.
It's concentration camp inmates reading the liberators, right?
Right, so I think it's partially that these are potentially survivors, people who had survived the camp. Are they greeting their liberators? Possible. Yeah. Yeah.
You said the camp was liberated sometime in 1945.
Yeah, April. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, maybe they are supposed to be greeting their liberators, but two things. The first thing is that they don't look as emaciated as they should, for the most part, I feel like. And the second thing is that when I read Erica Jacobi's testimony, she wrote about how cruel the Soviet liberators were and how they were raping women and how they were kind of being selfish. I mean, I'm sure that's not true in every case.
Right.
It wasn't all that.
Right. Well, one piece of knowledge to just have is that in 1946 and 47, and actually shortly thereafter, the Soviets interned and killed around 7,000 people in this concentration camp. And it was part of the Gulag that Stalin was involved with. And so this camp, unfortunately, had another history of mass killing that was not associated with the Nazis. It was a special action carried out where the Soviets sent dissidents of communism and political prisoners. And so these people depicted there are probably not those people. But it's remarkable that you have a Nazi camp that then becomes part of a Stalinist camp just a few years later. And so it kind of bespeaks your point, which is that the Soviets weren't always, at these moments, just liberators. They were also, to a certain extent, oppressors. Partially when women were systematically raped, which happened throughout most German cities during the final months of the war, and also the fact that some of these camps were repurposed for purposes of the Gulag. So that's one part of this in terms of the politics of memory. It's not just a straightforward, only the Nazis did this. There were also Soviets who were complicit in crimes that were committed at the same place. Mm-hmm.
Which I think, Soviet propaganda did present them all like heroes, like these are saviors.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting that the difference in this being again like so happy to see
Right.
liberators when it meant like that might not have been exactly.
Right.
Like that level of joy probably wasn't. I think during a lot of the liberations of the various camps, like there was a lot of fear about like what would happen next.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Right. So, the question here is, for one thing, the perspective being presented here is that the Soviets defeated fascism, they were triumphant, and everyone was thankful that happened, and now people are free. But there was also really no attention to the victims themselves. These people here who are, they're not only, you mentioned kind of in good shape, relatively, raising potentially, I don't know if this is a flag or what this is, but this person, the kind of this idea of, we're all free, things, thank you for saving us. There's no recognition of who the victims are. There's no names given to the victims. And then, looking at this architecturally, it's pretty interesting, what is this tradition of kind of great kind of monuments that are being pointed out here? I mean, a sense of a kind of looking at maybe a Greco-Roman architectural tradition, which is obviously it's a monument with colonnades and stone and so forth, but a sense of kind of something triumphal. I mean, what triumphed? I mean, essentially, what was triumphed over? Why 1945 would be considered not just an end of the war, but also kind of clearly a victory, and an important victory to celebrate, to be sure, which is the defeat of fascism. But again, how does that fit within the ideology of the time? Why were the victims not given really any kind of recognition? I mean, you could think, to give you another sense of this, I mean, imagine you think of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which is all about the victims, and it's really not a triumphal monument at all. And so this tells you a little bit of kind of like what we mean by the politics of memory. To what extent are the victors and what extent the victims are being depicted, and sort of at what cost and with what kind of narrative, right? So when we talk about collective memories, we're talking about things like, museums, memorials, monuments, school curricula, any kind of public forms of commemoration. And these things are always kind of political. I mean, they just by definition are. Mainly because we, meaning me and you and others, don't have these memories. We weren't liberated. We weren't there. We weren't part of this, and yet it's being presented to us in a certain way. So you might contrast this. I mean, for example, to give you a sense of this kind of contrast, I mean, this is the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. This is all about the victims. And in many ways, the whole purpose of this museum is really to talk about the people who were killed. And so, kind of thinking about the tower motif again, like think of this tower here, no names. It's just a kind of architectural monument of sort of triumph. Here's another tower. This is a tower of photographs of a town in which all the Jews were killed by a mobile killing unit in 1941, one of those Einsatz commandos. And so the pictures were taken shortly before the town in two different times, one at the end of the 19th century, one in 1941, of every single person in the town. Every single person in these pictures is dead. They were shot in mass grave. And so, to think of the effect this has as you're walking through the museum in 1993, you're going to be overwhelmed, looking up at this tower of all these people, it's women, children, men, old, young, all murdered anonymously, right? It's a very different approach to thinking about, it's not triumphal at all. It's not, the war is over, yay, we're liberated, but really, let's confront the sheer atrocity, right? The span of the atrocity. Another example, this is also the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, is it goes to this experiential dimension. I mentioned earlier that memory, as you said, is experiential. Oftentimes it's very hard to make history experiential unless one is able to put one's own body in that space. So the idea that the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which was established the same year that Schindler's List came out, will try to create almost an experience that makes your own body a little bit queasy, a little bit uncertain, a little bit shaky. And I think this is actually quite effective because it kind of gives you a sense of being involved in history in a way that isn't safe, right? It's not exactly like, I'm just looking at pictures, I'm good. But if I start to enter into an actual boxcar used as a deportation train, suddenly, the effect is going to be very different. It's not even a mock-up. Right? We're not talking about, what a boxcar might have looked like. This was a boxcar in which people were deported. And not only could you peer inside of it, you could go inside of it. What does this mean? Have you transgressed a border? Like, have you gone into something that's, sacred? A place where obviously people suffered and probably died. A place where people were certainly brought to their death. And yet it's been relocated to Washington, D.C. It's kind of out of context in some ways, but it allows us an access point to a history that is, there and then, here and now. It's kind of common, actually. There's a lot of boxcars that have been brought to the United States. This is an example in Naples, Florida, It's a Holocaust museum. People can, when it's open, you can go inside of it. Obviously, sometimes they open the doors and you go in, and sometimes they're closed. But there's stairs here, so you could obviously get in. Is it tacky? I mean, maybe someone could argue that it is. That it's taking something and putting it on display and letting people, go and take, selfies in front of. Is that tacky? Maybe. Is there a way that we should respond, to this? I mean, do we have to, bow our heads? Do we have to keep silent? Do we have to pay our respects? What does it mean to actually stand in front of it and take a selfie? I mean, it's a really interesting question about how do you connect in a responsible way to the past, but also in a way that maybe, doesn't try to moralize. Like, I'm not going to say, don't do it. I mean, I think, it's really interesting to me. I was talking to a Holocaust survivor who's 90 years old, and she took selfies of herself in a concentration camp at age 90 and was very proud of it. Now you say, why did she do that? Well, she went back to the very camp that she was interned in with her children and grandchildren years later, and she was so happy to be alive and be back there that, in fact, she wanted the whole process documented. And there's all these pictures of her smiling, and she's sitting around. She's 90 years old in a wheelchair, and she's really happy to be back there. And they put these pictures on Facebook and other things, and it's remarkable, right? So to me, maybe it's the perspective, of course. It's obviously very different from a survivor to take a selfie than for you to take a selfie. But my point is that, time changes. People interact with the past in different ways. And I think it's an interesting question as to how memory and history often are, they're always moving, always changing. A couple other examples before I go to Spiegelman, which will really, I think, concretize these issues. This is a remarkable memorial. I actually grew up in Miami, and I remember seeing this when I was a kid. I was always so surprised by how moving it was. It's a hand, a sculpture hand. It's several stories high, inscribed with a number, obviously a tattoo, and then bodies of people kind of wailing and twisted and contorted, kind of coming out of it. Some of whom are screaming, others whom are trying to get out. And then as a whole, it looks like a hand, coming up out of the ground. And this is a remarkable Holocaust memorial created, to really convey the embodied sense of terror and fear and horror, right? And it does that. Also, given the patina, the green colored, it was painted, and then over time with the rain and everything else and the elements, it kind of has begun to, take on this brown and kind of weathered color. The artist himself, really amazing, had created these clay and then bronze statues. So this is actually a statue, it's not a person. It's a woman with a child, this person crying out. All these hundreds of statues were then attached to that central arm. And it's really quite remarkable in terms of trying to capture the emotions of fear and horror, right, in a very embodied way. And this memorial, it's a public memorial, and as you can see, it's available there. The last one I'll talk about is one that's kind of, in many ways, kind of an opposite to that. This is a memorial in Berlin, established, the biggest memorial of its kind, in fact, in Berlin. And I'll talk about this in the last day of class a little bit more, but I just want to say that it was constructed and opened to the public in 2005, and it consists just of concrete blocks. And the blocks are of different sizes. There's actually 2,700 blocks, and they kind of form this large, almost like topographical wave of sorts. So you can see people, at the beginning there, the blocks are kind of like yay high, like a foot, 2 feet. But as you go into the memorial, the blocks get very high, and so it's like your experience is kind of like this. You're like in the memorial, and all you see are these concrete columns. And the whole thing is kind of like a wave. It's a little disorienting. Now, there are no people depicted here. In fact, the Holocaust memorial is just blocks. Right? If you think of this connection to this, where it's a very, figuration, people, the human body, right? The violation of the body is the key thing. This is just, this is very abstract, right? There's no real reference to the Holocaust. In fact, it doesn't really even 2,700 concrete blocks doesn't really mean anything with regard to the Holocaust. And yet, that's the national memorial in Berlin, exactly next to, you can see there's the Reichstag. So this is their parliament building, You know, it's really, this is like putting it on the mall in Washington, D.C., right next to like the Capitol or something. Very central. But how does this refer to the Holocaust, do you think? Or does it? Have any of you been there, by chance? No? Yeah? So what was it like? Since you raised your hand. Did you go in it? Like, did you walk through it? Yeah?
I mean, for me, it kind of resembled coffins in some ways.
Hmm.
That's kind of what struck me is it was just like, and it's just like overwhelming when you like walk inside it, like you said, it's like over your head,
Mm-hmm.
and you just like, it slowly kind of just like engulfs you.
It slowly engulfs you. Yeah, so in this regard, maybe this is how it speaks to the Holocaust, right? It doesn't actually refer to the actual people that were killed, but it creates an effect on you as a viewer, as you become engulfed in something, like physically. Yeah. You got a little lost in it. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. It creates a kind of, I mean, it's almost like as you go into it, you said not only do you get lost, but it becomes very quiet and eerie. The sense of, you know, you don't see much light. It's actually hard, you become disoriented very easily. Like which way is north, which way is south. It's hard to get out of it in some ways, although you can always proceed to like one of the edges. But it does create this sense of kind of disorientation. And in that regard, I think it also, that's probably how it speaks to the Holocaust. You imagine like the experience of a victim not knowing what was going to come next, not knowing what happened to one's family, not knowing, you know, all the things that we expect about control and our future, right? So his goal here was to create this effect of, you know, massive like dizziness, psychic and physical disorientation. And that would be how to speak to the Holocaust rather than represent the events of the Holocaust in a kind of embodied monument or a kind of, you know, with even names. There are no names. It doesn't talk about any victims by name. It creates an experience for visitors in the present.
Does the size of the blocks represent the amount of people killed or anything like that?
No. No, the monument doesn't, there's no direct correlation between like the number of blocks or the size and people killed. No. No. It's just the amount of space that was given to them to put the monument up. Yeah. So we'll come back to that. I want you to think about it because we'll look at some other memorials the very last day and how they function, you know, again, in terms of thinking about collective memory. But now we're going to turn to kind of singular memory and questions of transmission and also a very different genre than what we have been looking at in the sense that we haven't looked at a graphic novel as a genre for thinking about Holocaust memory and history until now. So Maus 1 and 2, there's 2 volumes. I asked you only to look at Maus Volume 1, although hopefully some of you may have realized there's a second volume. You can look at it at your leisure. This is Art Spiegelman. He completed the work, actually almost a period of around 20 years and many different iterations, some of which the characters were developed prior to Maus in some of the comics that he had published in really kind of more off-mainstream venues. This is a portrait of the artist as, so to speak, as a mouse, and he's behind, you know, kind of his creation here. And this, of course, is the artist. So it's a story, if you had a chance to look at it, it's really 3 stories that kind of intertwine. And I mentioned earlier, it's the story primarily of his father, a Polish Holocaust survivor by the name of Wladek, who lives in the United States, who's remarried. It's his story, what he went through. It's the story of the son, right, Art Spiegelman himself, right, being represented as an interlocutor, as in dialogue with his father. Artie is the second generation. In many ways, it's like Michael Berg asking Hannah, you know, what she did. In this case, instead of asking a perpetrator, it's the son asking the father, right? Again, it's like, Father, what did you go through during the war? It's the flip side of, Father, what did you do during the war, right? So getting his father's story. So it's the story of getting his father's story and all the problems that involves. And then there's a kind of a third dimension, which I would say is the absent story of his mother, right? It's the fact of that her story not only being lost, but actually we find out destroyed by his father. Because it only existed in memoirs and notebooks and diaries. And at one point, the father decided to purge all this because it was just too much for him. He couldn't take it. He just got rid of it and burned it all. And so there's this kind of haunting absence, right, which is also in the story, of a story that will never be told, right, a story that's been lost, that of Anya, his mom. In every case, I would say it's a kind of testimony that's in many ways marked by things that are very fundamental or kind of very profound about memory. It's fragile. It's traumatic, right? It's marked by trauma. It's marked by extraordinary trauma. And there's this notion of contingency, meaning it may or may not be possible to find it. Contingency simply means it's dependent upon many things. It's kind of that which may be possible, but maybe not. So the contingency memory, like I might be able to get it, but I might not. I might be able to find my mother's stories, but I might not. I might tell you these things, and I might not. That's contingency. So this is what kind of marks this testimony. So how do we understand this as a genre? I mean, for one thing, it is a true story. It happens to be presented in a graphical format, which is, obviously derived from the history of comics. Spiegelman himself was an illustrator and had published, like I said, some of these before. When the New York Times actually reviewed the book, they characterized it as fiction. And this threw Spiegelman really up in arms, as you could imagine. It's not fiction. Now, he writes to them, he says, to the extent to which fiction indicates that a work isn't factual, I feel a bit queasy. I know that by delineating people with animal heads, I've raised problems of taxonomy for you. Maybe you could consider adding a special nonfiction/mice category to your list. The New York Times actually changed its declaration of saying fiction and included it as part of nonfiction. But obviously this was a question in some ways of genre for the New York Times originally because of the way in which the material was presented. It wasn't a testimony in the sense of a narrative. It wasn't a film. It wasn't a set of photographs. It wasn't a work of literature in the sense of like what we read with the reader. It was this kind of hybrid format of certainly attesting to events in the past, composing them in a kind of chronological way, so it speaks a little bit like history, and yet there's a very profound visual dimension, which is everybody has been turned into an animal, right? Everyone in the book, there are really no humans other than a couple of photographs, which we'll talk about in a minute, but everyone in the narrative is an animal. They're either a cat, they're a mouse, or they're a pig. And if you go to volume 2, you also get dogs and frogs. So everyone's an animal. And that raised problems of taxonomy for the New York Times. It also raised questions about what's at stake in depicting everyone essentially as an animal, right? So what does this mean? Well, for one thing, we can get a little bit of insight by looking at sort of the framing devices, kind of like the quotes at the very beginning of the volume. And so if you open the volume and you look before even the book begins, you get a quote that he includes by Adolf Hitler. The Jews are undoubtedly a race, but they're not human. Astounding, right? Essentially the Jews are something else besides human. They're a race, but they're not human. Maybe they're animals. Maybe they're subhuman. And then in the second volume, you get another one, which is really quite interesting. And it says Mickey Mouse, so a mouse, a nice mouse that we like. Mickey Mouse is the most miserable ideal ever created. The dirty and filth-covered vermin, the greatest bacteria carrier of the animal kingdom, like mice, rats, cannot be the ideal type of animal. Away with the Jewish brutalization of the people. Down with Mickey Mouse. Wear the swastika cross, with pride. And this is from a newspaper article in Germany in the 1930s. So these two framing devices kind of offer us insight as to why is everyone turned into an animal? In particular, why are Jews mice? So why are Jews mice? Mm-hmm. Right.
sometimes in relation to a mouse, a big predator.
Right. In relationship, certainly the cat-mouse relationship is, we know Tom and Jerry, right? This is a predator-prey, right? We know that. So that's part of the idea. Pigs don't really usually figure into this ecosystem, but pigs are there, but as poles, which again raises a question too about, how do we think of pigs? Are they dirty? Are they slothful? Are they, what are they? And why would poles be represented as a whole like that? There's an interesting kind of, racialization that one would need to confront there. But I think you're right about the issue of at least rats. Rats are certainly connected with vermin. And we know, if you remember the history of anti-Semitism in the film we saw, The Eternal Jew, at the very beginning of class, you might remember the conflation of Jews and vermin and rats. And in many ways, what Spiegelman is doing is he's turning this around. He's inverting it. I mean, not to say that Jews now are rats, but they're mice, maybe a little bit more, whatever, quote-unquote clean, but certainly he's taking an anti-Semitic trope and he's inverting it, right? Now suddenly these mice are very human, and they have certain qualities. I mean, what qualities do they have? Yeah? Mm-hmm.
Well, my grandma used to say that the Polish were doing better during the war.
Right.
And this is quoting her,
Yeah.
Holocaust survivor. And the Germans themselves, and at times they were worse. And she would say that she wished the world would open up and swallow Poland.
I see. Well, there's a lot of among survivors, and I think that's probably given credence in this memoir, is that there was a significant amount of knowledge and complicity among the Poles, particularly the Polish police in rounding up Jews, and many survivors had very negative associations with Poles. And I imagine Spiegelman is also building on that existing view, which could also be stereotyped in certain ways because it's undifferentiated. We know there were also Poles that did things that saved Jews, but there were many that didn't.
There's also this really ambiguous role that Polish people play, which fits into what people think of as pigs, because at times they're disgusting and filthy, but then they're also some people see them as really intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
So because you can't easily label
Right.
I guess aspects of a pig.
Good point.
That work for Poles, but and also in the sense that pigs are slaughtered.
Right.
So they have a vulnerability that mice have that cats don't have.
Right.
That in that is appropriate for them, it's not
Right. Pigs are slaughtered. I think you're exactly right. They have a certain vulnerability in that sense. And mice are not slaughtered for food. Neither are cats. And so you're right. The pigs have this. It's an interesting category to pick because it's a little bit more ambiguous, is your term. And I think that's exactly right. The predator-prey relationship is very clear between cats and mice. And clearly, if you remember, this anti-Semitic trope, we remember the association of Jews and vermin, right? You remember probably, we watched this, we talked about it, now 8 weeks ago, but clearly, right? The animal, the rats. So just like the Jews go everywhere, the rats go everywhere. Right? So you might remember this. This is 1940, right? This is German propaganda film that rats destroy things and Jews destroy things, and they're equivalent. And clearly, he's aware of this kind of this history of anti-Semitism, and certainly in providing this quote from Hitler, he's thinking about this and inverting it, turning it some ways on its head, because these mice are not only very human-like, but they're also humanized, right? We often think of dehumanization happening when you're turned into the conditions of being an animal, right? These most base instincts have to take over. But in many ways, these are the most human animals possible, right? They're gentle, they have families, you can see their relations, they touch each other, they hug each other, they care for each other. They have little mice, little children. They're good-looking mice, like this one down here. This is Vladik, when he was kind of in his heyday, dating, women all over the place. He was a good-looking mouse. And all this is to say is that he was very humanized, right? He's very humanized. And so there's this aspect of thinking about this whole history of dehumanization that we've been talking about in the class for so long. And part of this is also to humanize the experience, but to do so in a kind of ironic way, by using animals to humanize. And so you also see kind of in the juxtaposition of this figure, both a kind of a portal back to like before the war, right, in the sense of the time before the catastrophe. But look, it's connected, visually with this, right? It's him, in the United States, in talking to Artie, who's there smoking, right? So, and then of course the tattoo, the number, right, on his arm. So all this is to say is you have in the condensation of the images the whole process of getting memory, getting history, propelling it forward, and sort of all the ways in which these different memories are almost like intersecting, like bleeding into one another. And he even says it very clearly. My father bleeds history. It's like what's inside comes out. It's history. It's who he is. It's also what runs, it carries the oxygen in his blood. It's what makes him human in some ways, and what makes him survive. His father bleeds history. So this is, and I'll show you another scene which you hadn't seen before, unless you read part 2, but he explains where the tattoo actually came from. And the tattoo came from when he was sent to Auschwitz, and this happened towards the end of the war. So where volume 1 ends up is they're sent to a ghetto, they escape the ghetto, they're hiding, going from place to place, a radical uncertainty. Finally, they're outed and rounded up in their attempt to escape from Poland and sent to Auschwitz. And part 2 takes up at the point where they're sent to Auschwitz, which he refers to in the comic strip as Mauschwitz, which is also, strange, right? Put an M in front of Auschwitz and you get Mauschwitz. So what happens in Auschwitz? Well, in many ways, things that are similar to, what Schindler shows, what Spielberg shows us in Schindler's List, right? You remember the pictures of, naked bodies, right? That, in this case, he's used visual means to depict getting a shower, being deloused, right? Being marched through the camp, getting camp clothes because they're not being killed. They've been selected for forced labor. And they've been tattooed, they've been given, they've been beaten, as the case right here, and they've been given clothing that they would wear in the labor camp. So this is the connection, between part 1 and part 2. Now, think about this. I won't have time to really talk about it right now, but just think about the way in which the horror is being depicted, right, visually. Think about how it compares to film. Think about how it compares to photographs, which are almost always from the perspective of the perpetrators, right? There's a sort of violation, I think, in the photographs that we see, which is that Nazis were the ones primarily taking them of the victims. This is obviously a form of depiction that comes out of a survivor, and particularly a second-generation survivor, someone who's inheriting a story. So, let's look at this. Is when they receive knowledge of Kristallnacht, and really the question is, what does this form of telling the history of the Holocaust allow us to learn or appreciate about the history of the Holocaust that we wouldn't necessarily have appreciated in another format, in another genre? So, it's really a question of what is the visual depiction with this kind of narrative tell us about the Holocaust. Here they're receiving news of Kristallnacht. There was a pogrom. It happened in Germany. All these synagogues were destroyed. They receive news about this, but aren't really quite sure what to make of that news, right? So it's a sense of foreboding and a sense of a destruction coming, but not yet knowing what the significance is, not knowing where it's going to lead to. Like, is this the end or the beginning? It was the beginning, right? And we know this after the fact. We didn't necessarily know it then. So I'll talk a little bit about how Artie composes his father's memories. For one thing, memories are not chronological, right? If everyone, you can think about this, think about all these times from your childhood. You often think about memories in terms of images. Very rarely do memories come out in narrative form. They're usually not narratives. They may be connected with stories, but for the most part, think of something that happened to you when you were in 4th grade that was an offense to you, or that time, you broke up with someone, or you have images. They take a form of images. And so they begin to meld together, they're reinterpreted, we give them a narrative, we explain them, we make them meaningful, right? This all happens. And in many ways, what Artie is doing is he's providing both a narrative, and in some ways he's providing images, but yet he's not doing the drawing. Or sorry, his father's not doing the drawing, Artie's doing the drawing. Right? So in many ways, Artie is providing his father with images of his memories. Really interesting idea, right? It's not the father saying, this is what it looked like, I'm going to draw a picture for you, except in those rare occasions where he says, here's how the bunker looked, and here's the hidden wall, or here's what Auschwitz looked like. But for the most part, Artie is composing images of his father's memory. And he's taking what his father tells him and putting it into a narrative visual form. And so therefore, we're talking about the transmission of memory across generations, across language. His father doesn't always speak perfect English. It's across geography. It's the United States versus Poland. It's decades later, and it's across 2 generations. And so he creates the visuals for a story that's not his own. And in doing this, he also captures the process of doing this. Not as much as he tells the story of what Vladek went through, he's also showing you the getting of the story, the way in which he interviewed his father and puts himself in the scene. It's kind of a Landsman-like technique, where Landsman sticks himself in the frame and just shows you, how am I doing this? He's there. Artie's there. He's smoking. He's like telling you, he's like, I'm talking to my dad, and the dad is pedaling away, and I'm interested in this. And he shows us, in the scene how the memories were gotten. Now, it's interesting that memory, in this case, is always connected with trauma. And I mean, this is, I think, a really telling sequence where his father remembers some, Jewish men who were hung, who were betrayed, kind of hung for a week, in fact, outside the ghetto. And they were meant to, make a point to others who might behave in that way. Now, this is what I think is so remarkable, is that these memories haunt him, right? So visually, it's like the memory of this searing image is ingrained in his head. And then Spiegelman depicts this on the right-hand side of something that he can't get away. He says, I still cry, even from my dead eye to this day. So this is the present, talking about a trauma that's depicted over here of history. So it's like history, memory, telling a memory, all on the same sequence. And that's really remarkable. So this is the events that happen. That's the history. The trauma is over there. It's like, what does it mean to you? I'm still scared by it. I'm still saddened by it. I still am affected by it. And then it's the telling of it to Artie right here, who asks him something else. He asks him not about this event. He asks him about his mom. He asks him about Anya. And so it's like, so what was Anya doing at this time? He's like, that's great. You saw all this. That's horrible. But what was mom doing? Oh, she was doing housework, knitting, reading. She was writing always her diary. Whoa. We suddenly realize that the mom story existed side by side, and yet it never is accessed, right? So it's like, again, this is all very much, I wouldn't say it's a one-sided story. It's a story of Vladek without Anya in a number of ways, without her and her own words, her own images, because they don't exist anymore. And again, he's telling you the process by which this happens. So down here, it's like, her diaries didn't survive from the war. What you saw, she wrote after. Her whole story from the start. Oh my God, where are they? This is mom, right? Anya. I need those for this book. Cough, please, Artie. Stop with the smoking. It makes me short of breath. I think it's all your peddling. Don't be so smart. Well, I'm telling you, yes, after the hanging, I looked like another business. I started trading. He goes back to his story. So it's an interesting kind of way of both avoidance, right? He's not going to talk about his mom's story. He's not going to talk about that Vladek, is actually responsible for the fact that his mom's diaries are gone. Artie wanting that story, and then the way in which history, memory, and trauma all kind of come together in this visual domain. Thoughts, reactions? There's a number of other slides I have, but I want to kind of take a pause in case you have questions or thoughts, reactions. No? Hmm?
I don't remember when the movie came out, but Spielberg on American Tail,
Mm-hmm.
where it has Jewish mice who escape Tsarist Russia
Hmm.
because of the attack by cats.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to come to America because
Ah.
the streets are paved with cheese.
American Tail, huh? When did that come out? I don't know. Yeah.
Cute movie.
Someone can Google it and find out. Yeah, but it's a kind of another citation of a similar sort of depiction. Yeah, mice and cats, and in this case, cheese. So no cheese in mouse. Yeah. Late 80s, so it's almost like around the same time. Yeah, interesting. I don't know if there's a connection in terms of, there probably is. I don't know. I'm not familiar with it. Okay. Yeah, so I just want to go back to the absent story of his mother, because this is again, a kind of, there's only one time in Mouse 1 where you get kind of this, you get a photograph. And this photograph is of his mom and him as a boy, and it's about the suicide of his mother. And this is a kind of an interrupting moment in the narrative. Really extraordinary for a lot of reasons, because she kills herself in 1968. This is before Artie would have had a chance to start to compose. Maybe he would have interviewed her in the same way. And in fact, what this sequence is actually composed separate from Mouse. It was composed earlier and published earlier, and then reinserted into this book. But one of the things she says as well is that she left no note. She didn't even give an explanation. And one's meant to take from it that, you know, she couldn't continue to live with the traumas of the Holocaust. She too was a survivor. And I mean, truth be told, a lot of Holocaust, not a lot, but quite a number of Holocaust survivors who had gone through similar traumas also committed suicide, most famously for our class, Paul Celan and Primo Levi. Both killed themselves, Celan in 1970 and Primo Levi in 1986. And one wonders, you know, again, what it is of having to live, you know, years or even decades later with what you went through that would drive you to the point of taking your own life. But it's not an isolated thing. So what's interesting for our purposes is that the place where this book ends, it ends over there with Artie calling his father a murderer. And this is, you know, again, quite remarkable because, you know, clearly, like, we know who the murderers are, right? We say, you know, the cats. It's the Nazis. They were the murderers. And yet now his father is kind of characterized at the very last, as he mutters to himself. He's so frustrated. He finds out his father had, you know, destroyed these diaries from his mother, and therefore destroyed her story and made it inaccessible. And he maybe is no better than a murderer. Is it a strong accusation? Of course it is. Is it a fair one? Maybe, maybe not. But again, thinking about you know, questions of accessibility, of memory, of history, how it lives on, what doesn't live on, who makes decisions about that. All these are kind of questions, you know, that the narrative raises. I have a couple more slides I want to finish. Come back to that last point at the end. One other thing I wanted to point out is that this narrative is so interesting in terms of thinking about animals because of this question of passing and what might be called masking. So at one point, you might remember that when Anya and Artie are walking around trying to find a place, you know, people to take them in, they try to pass as Polish. They put on pig masks, right? I mean, literally try to say, like, I'm not a mouse, I'm a Pole. You know, and this is, I mean, Zenon's exact itinerary. He's like, I'm not a Jew, I'm a Pole. He lived his whole life in the open, as many of you got a chance to talk to him last Friday, as a Pole. He got new identity, new papers. The problem, as you can see, the tail, right? The problem is Anya doesn't quite pass, right? She doesn't quite pass as Polish. And this question of, can you mask an identity? Can you take on a new identity? Can you pass as something else? What does it mean, for someone, this person, hey, there's a Jewess in this courtyard. I found one, get out, right? This idea of being betrayed by your neighbors, right? This is something that Spiegelman really captures, I think, in a profound way as one thinks about, the mutability of identity and the perception, right? The perception that you're a Jew, you're not a Jew. You're a Pole, you're not a Pole. You're this, you're not that. You're acceptable, you're not acceptable. You can pass, you can, you look like. Where these stereotypes come from and where this kind of power, also this power of everyday policing comes in. Think about, the questions around hiding and outing. And the fact is that sometimes the neighbors can be very cruel, right? You're undocumented. Out. Find you. Same thing. All right. Let me go to the end here because I'm just actually, I'm going to go to the final page of Mouse. This is the last page of the second volume, and I think it kind of comes in some ways full circle from the first volume. If you haven't read it, I'm going to read it to you because I think it's really quite extraordinary. So he survived the war. It turns out that Anya also survived the war. They were both sent to Auschwitz. They managed to reunite on the very last page. That is to say, they had been separated and they reunite. Look who's here. Somebody found Anya. Find Anya. Bring her right away. And somebody found her. Gasp. He's utterly sorry. There's like Vladek and Anya reunited. Vladek. It was such a moment that everybody around was crying together with us. Anya, Anya, my Anya. More I don't need to tell you. We were both very happy and lived happy ever after. So let's stop, please. Your tape recorder. I'm tired from talking, Richu, and it's enough stories for now. And then a gravestone of his dad and mom. What do you make of this last panel? With regard to like how it ties things up or doesn't tie things up? Right, so it's like he calls Artie Richu, right? It's the kid who was killed, who died in the ghetto. So this kind of almost, this is, again, you think about trauma. You think about the way in which trauma outlives, in many ways, outlives like the scene, so to speak. What else? I mean,
He kind of sweeps everything under the rug here at the end. We lived happily ever after.
No, it wasn't the case for her, right? I mean, Anya lived constantly with depression and suicidal thoughts. She killed herself. In many ways, the father maybe sweeps this under the rug. I don't know, does Spiegelman do so? It's interesting. I don't know. I mean, when providing a memorial, in many ways, this book now stands as a memorial to both of his parents' history, and he imagines the two of them, reunited in death, in having a common gravestone. But we certainly know that process of a family being fragmented, broken apart, a person whose story Richu's will never be known. Anya's largely not known. Vladek's known, but also mediated in all kinds of ways by the son. So it raises a lot of kind of questions. As much as it brings things together, it also opens up a kind of Pandora's box of questions about how memory in the present continues to function or not function. I'll use my last 5 minutes, last slides. So this is Spiegelman, and just kind of think about this as you kind of like go back to Maus. He talks about sort of like his mode of operating here. He says, I need to show the events like the Holocaust and the memory of the Holocaust without showing them. I need to show them without showing them. That's a really interesting kind of thing. I'm going to show them, but I'm not going to show them. I want to show the masking of these events in their representation. Meaning the events of the Holocaust are in some ways masked in the way in which they're presented in a form, in a visual form, in the form of a graphic novel, in film. So there's a sense of showing and not showing, a sense of how the representation gives us some point of access, but in other ways it actually covers things up. And so this is an interesting kind of, assessment of sort of his, way of thinking. As we go forward, think about that. Last slide I want to show you is actually this. And this is maybe one way to think about this question of, where Spiegelman fits, in thinking about the history of the Holocaust. Maybe it's a question of thinking about a kind of a memory that comes after. And this is post-memory, is a term that a Holocaust historian by the name of Mariana Hirsch created. It doesn't really mean after memory. It means the ways in which another generation inherits someone else's memories. So if your parents had gone through something very traumatic and they pass this along to you, you take it in and make sense of it in certain ways. Right? Maybe they were an immigrant family. They're first generation to come to the United States, and they remember that time when they had to escape their country. And they've told you this over and over again. And in many ways, you've become burdened in some ways with that memory, but it also becomes who you are because you've taken it on. So post-memory refers to the profound and effective ways, the emotional ways, that a second generation inherits memories and histories that are not their own. This is what Spiegelman's doing. He's inheriting someone else's memories. They're not his. He didn't go through it. He doesn't have any experiential idea. He went through the process of learning about those memories, but he didn't go through the Holocaust. And so therefore, this is marked for him by a kind of imaginative investment. He has to imagine what it had been like. He draws pictures. He creates narratives. He tells you the process in which he composed it. He creates it. He takes them on in some ways as his own, almost like a surrogate memory. But eventually, at the end of the day, these memories aren't his own. They're inherited. And at the final analysis, they don't add up to a whole, right? They don't finally become, a totality. They're still fragmented. They're still suffused by trauma. They're still partial. There's things that are still lost. He'll never get Anya's story. He'll never know the totality of what his father went through. He'll never know, Richu's story. Again, it's a fragmentation. You inherit things, you make sense of them the best you can, but you also realize that they're still partial. They're still fragmented. They're still broken. At the end of the day, this is also a broken connection to the past. And in many ways, I think that's what Maus is about. It's about the brokenness of that connection to the past, and yet the desire to learn and make it one's own. Okay. We'll end there, and we'll take up with Holocaust eyewitness testimonies on Thursday.